We set the knife on a white towel so the rust wouldn't flake onto the steel table. The handle was wood swollen from years of damp, and a childish line cut into the grain had darkened to the color of coffee. EH 2005. Still here. The room hummed with the old air vent, but the words carried a heat of their own, as if they were still burning their way through time to be read. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. We say the names to keep them from disappearing twice. Before this story hardened into evidence bags and chain of custody forms, life in my corner of Idaho moved at a pace that let you hear your own footsteps. I lived in Boise then, a small condo on the second floor of a building that never tried to be anything more than what it was. The hallway smelled like laundry soap and new carpet. My porch looked down on a strip of grass narrow as a necktie and a parking space that baked to 100 degrees by noon in July. I worked out of a beige office with humming fluorescents and a window that faced the courthouse flag. On mornings when the heat rose early, I left the car and walked the 6 blocks, coffee cooling against my palm case files, thumping quiet against my hip. My days were routine in the way that keeps a person sane. Intake interviews, lab drop-offs, quiet notes after lunch. Truth doesn't usually sit on the surface. It takes the slow kind of looking. That July, the high country was all dust and glare, the kind that floats in the air like pollen and turns your boots white by lunchtime. Up north, 27 miles of washboard roads and switchbacks, away from the nearest real grocery store, Granite Creek Camp, had opened for its second session. If you haven't driven those stretches, you might picture a postcard blue sky hung over peaks, radio fading to static the smell of sun-baked pine. What I remember from later visits is smaller, a narrow turnout, with a bent, no fire sign. A creek that talks in the same voice day and night, the wooden posts around a fire circle blackened to a shine. The camp made sense the way most summer camps do. Nylon tents marked with thick Sharpie letters, a plastic tub of first aid supplies that always needed restocking, wire racks for drying wet socks, a clipboard and a whistle and a laminated emergency map clipped to a nail by the mess canopy. If you'd walked in before dinner on that Friday, you would have seen the choreography of a working routine, a counselor shaking out a lighter to coax a flame, a handful of boys trading jokes too fast to catch, the last of the dishwater tossing into the dirt with a soft slap, a sun dropping slow behind the ridge until the light ran through the trees like thin syrup. Andrea Shipley carried that clipboard, the kind of young adult who leans into responsibility with both hands. She moved through the clearing with her hair swept back and her sleeves rolled to her elbows, counting heads, nodding at small victories fire-contained water jug topped off nobody trying to roast a hot dog with a green branch. Her voice carried just enough to be heard and not enough to sound like scolding. Shoes under the cot, she told one boy, and he grinned and did it the way kids do when the rules are simple and the sun hasn't gone down yet. I never knew these moments firsthand, only in the way investigators learn them later through receipts, watch times, wristwatches with stopped batteries, through the way people smile when they talk about what they thought would matter and what they thought wouldn't. But I can still place the pieces. Before the light faded, the older counselor dragged a bucket of creek water over to the fire ring, the handle scraping the rock like a dull bell. A few yards away, a pair of boys argued over whose turn it was to hold the flashlight during ghost stories. Somebody tossed a pine cone and hit the lid of the bear can with a clank that brought laughter from 3 tents at once. Small comforts, small sounds, everything in order. The rhythm of that place wasn't just the camps. It belonged to the wider valley, dust plumes trailing the forest road when someone headed out late. Motorcycles miles away sounding like hornets. A prop plane once in a while low enough to cast a square of shadow across the treetops. At Granite Creek, the natural clock is set by temperature and light. Sunset in July brings relief when you've been cooking in 90 degrees of air. Sweat dries. Shirts go back on. The fire becomes the center of everything. Kids lean closer, and their voices fall into that sleepy, giddy range that tells you they'll be out cold 10 minutes after lights out. The three boys who anchored that session, Caleb, Mason, and Elijah, found each other in the way kids do by gravitating toward one another's orbit at the mess table and then pretending they hadn't. You can tell it from the photos taken earlier that afternoon, faces damp with river spray, a borrowed ball cap on the wrong head, a bandage on a chin that had met a slippery rock too fast. None of them looked like they were trying to be anything yet. Camp tends to level kids like that. No Letterman jackets to separate them. No classroom rows, just a common tent with a zipper that sticks if you pull it the wrong way. From Andrea's later notes, I know the small things. Caleb kept a pebble in his pocket because he swore he could tell quartz from granite by touch. Mason had a way of leaning back on his palms, eyes up, as if ideas were falling from the sky. Elijah watched everything, especially the edges of the clearing, the dark line where the campsite ended and the woods began. That's a common thing with first-year campers. They're fine by the fire, but they measure the shadows. They stand at the boundary and squint like they might read the night if they stare long enough. I've walked that boundary at dawn. The air is cold and damp enough to bite the lungs. The low ground sucks heat out of your legs, and the creek sows itself through the rocks with a monk's steady patience. If you kneel and set your palm on the dirt, it's powder over hardpack, easy to mark and easy to lose a mark if a breeze decides to roll through. I say that because you need to know how light the world felt then. Nobody expected weight. Back home in Boise that same summer, my life clicked along in routine mug washed and set upside down in the rack court filing stacked by date black shoes in a line by the door. My father had a habit of calling late, and I kept the ringtone for him different so it would cut through whatever report I was reading. We talked about tomatoes that wouldn't set in heat and the fish not biting at Lucky Peak. Safe talk. If I drove out after work, the highway lay open and flat, the foothills golden as wheat. I never saw Granite Creek on those nights. The truth is, for 20 years, almost no one did. At camp, the last hour of light put on a small show. The sky behind the ridge held a bruised line of purple, and the fire dropped from yellow to coals. A counselor shook a kettle of cocoa powder into a pail and stirred with a wooden spoon that clacked against the rim. You could pick out tent numbers by sound, one group still whispering too loud, another already settling into the soft thump of sleeping bags and the papery rip of a snack wrapper torn open under a blanket. Somebody sang half a verse of a hiking song in a voice not built for singing, earning a chorus of laughter that ended on its own. Andrea walked her loop. Teeth, she said, and they groaned, but they did it. She stood outside Tent 4 longer than the others, not because anything was wrong, just because the night had begun to drape itself across the clearing, and her job was to keep the edges tight. A small beam of light, somebody's flashlight, pinballed against nylon, making the tent glow like a lantern. It stopped. The zipper lifted an inch and dropped back. The soft scuffle of boys wriggling into bags, a voice young and steady. Good night? That's how I picture eventless nights, someone saying good night and meaning it. The older counselor raked a last lick of flame into the center and smothered it with a flap of damp burlap. He left the bucket within reach because that's what you do when you've learned the place and the wind. The sky ran out of color. The clearing took on its midnight posture, everything in place, and the air thick with the smell of ash and warm canvas. I didn't know any of them then. My world, my files, my hallway, my strip of lawn kept to its lane. When I think back, I try to open a window into that ordinary evening and let some air through. I picture a kid's damp towel hung over a branch like a flag of surrender. I picture a stray marshmallow petrified to the end of a stick. A baseball cap fallen just outside the tent flap brim in the dirt, because someone forgot it when the zipper finally came down. Those tiny misplacements might seem like nothing, but they're how I remember the world before. There was trust baked into the routines, the fire pit, the tally marks on the clipboard, the distance to the creek measured as 120 feet, a safe line, walked a dozen times before dark. There was a porch light quality to the camp lanterns, glowing under the canopy, the soft clink of a tin mug set mouth down to drain the hammock empty because everyone had finally run their legs out. If a coyote called from the far ridge, it came as part of the soundtrack, not a warning. I knew the counselor who checked the wildlife camera earlier that week. He told me later the lens had gone smudged with pollen, and he wiped it with the corner of his t-shirt and laughed at himself for caring about a gadget that rarely showed anything but deer and the glitter of moths. That's the kind of detail that makes me ache now how certain he was the land would behave, how much he trusted the pattern. We all did. In a place with few surprises, you forget that the dark is a season of its own. Andrea clicked her pen and drew one last line on the roster tents accounted for. Fire out. Lantern on the nail hooked to low. She walked to the edge of the clearing and listened not to spook herself, just to anchor the night. Creek soft. Wind low. No thunder. No insects fussing against the lantern glass. She scanned the tree line and saw nothing but branches shifting like a slow breath. She didn't think to look down at the dirt path just inside the pines. Why would she? It was only a path children used in daylight. A thread that wound to the creek and back past a tree with bark soft enough to take a mark. In Boise, I rinsed my mug and set it to dry. I checked the deadbolt and tugged the chain once, a habit my mother taught me when I moved into my first apartment. The fridge hummed. The hallway light outside my door clicked off on its timer, then back on when a neighbor walked their terrier down to the patch of grass. When I finally lay down, the room cooled fast enough to require the thin blanket I swore I wouldn't need. The city thinned to quiet. In the distance, a siren rose and fell and left the window glass still. At Granite Creek, a counselor laid a hand on the canvas wall of a tent and felt the woolly vibration of a boy's whisper on the other side. Then it steadied. Then it went still. He smiled and walked back toward his own cot. The lantern under the canopy burned on a low wick, its light a small golden coin against the canvas like a porch lamp in a storm left on, not for fear, just for kindness. The forest lifted its cool breath and settled it across the clearing. Out on the pitted forest road, a set of headlights never came around the bend. The camp held its pose. Somewhere in the pines, a single branch shifted and then stopped, and the night closed over the sound as if it never happened at all. Close to midnight, the wind slid down the ridge and pressed the tents a little flatter, then let them spring back. The lantern under the canopy burned lower. One patient flicker, then another, while the ash in the ring gave off a faint orange that didn't reach the trees. A zipper's metal tab rested against nylon and barely moved. The porch light glow stayed on waiting, and the phone on my nightstand didn't ring. When I woke that next morning, the air in Boise felt heavier than usual, thick with that kind of stillness that follows a restless dream. I didn't know it then, but a few hundred miles north, another kind of silence had settled over the forest. It would take hours before the first call reached the Department of Public Safety, and even longer before my desk phone lit up with the name of a place I'd never heard before, Granite Creek Camp. By then, the boys were already gone. The counselor's voice on the line was young, trembling, clipped by shock. "We've searched the whole perimeter," she kept saying. "The tents zipped from the inside." I asked her to slow down. "How many missing?" She hesitated. 3. I could hear the wind through her radio, the kind that rolls off the mountains like a low growl. When I arrived that afternoon, the forest road was cordoned off by local deputies and a few park rangers trying to look composed. The heat rose off the gravel in visible waves, and the trees on either side seemed to lean in, listening. Granite Creek Camp wasn't much, just a handful of tents scattered around a blackened fire ring, a mess canopy drooping with morning dew and a smell of smoke that had lingered too long. The boys' tent sat near the far edge of the clearing. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. Canvas sides pulled tight zipper shut, morning light bouncing off the nylon. Up close, that peace unraveled. The sleeping bags were unrolled but empty. One shoe sat near the corner, the other missing. Their clothes were folded in a neat pile, as if they'd planned to get dressed but never did. The counselor, Andrea Shipley, was sitting on a rock a few feet away, her hands locked around a paper cup. She looked up at me with eyes that didn't quite focus. "They were here," she said. "I saw them last night. I spent the first hour just walking the perimeter trying to feel the ground beneath my boots. The soil was soft but undisturbed. No drag marks, no prints, nothing but the random scatter of pine needles that should have been crushed if 3 boys had run through in the dark. A few rangers from the Forest Service were combing the trail with dogs, their calls echoing through the trees. The dogs whined, confused, doubling back on their own scent lines. It was as if the forest had inhaled those boys and refused to exhale them again. When I stepped into the tent, the air inside felt oddly warm, trapped from the night before. The smell was faintly sweet plastic and smoke. Near the back flap, one of the counselors had found a melted flashlight. I crouched beside it, careful not to disturb anything. The battery had burst, leaving a dark bloom on the canvas floor. Later, a lab tech would tell me the bulb had burned out around 12:17 a.m. Somehow, that small precision, the idea that light had a time of death, made everything else feel worse. Andrea led me to a tree about 20 yards from the camp. The bark was pale and smooth, where someone had scratched something crude into it with a stone, 4 stick figures, one drawn upside down. I ran my hand over the carving. The wood was fresh enough that a few flakes still clung to the trunk. "The boys used to draw," Andrea said quietly. "They liked to make little marks on things, signs for their trails." I asked if she recognized the drawing. She shook her head. "There were only 3 in that tent." She said it again, almost to herself. Only 3. That night the search widened. The sun dropped fast behind the ridge and the forest turned cold enough to bite. Search teams fanned out in concentric circles with headlamps shouting names that rolled down the ravine and came back as echoes. I followed one group toward the creek, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off wet stones. The water ran fast and shallow, chattering over rock like teeth clicking together. A pair of deputies waded in up to their knees, sweeping the banks with long poles. I remember the sound, the scrape of metal against stone, the dull splash of boots moving slow, careful. Above us, the sky was clean and endless stars pressed close enough to touch, and all that light felt wasted on what we couldn't see. By the 3rd day, the FBI had arrived with equipment none of us in state services could dream of: infrared imaging, aerial drones, thermal scanners. They brought calm, organized precision, but I could see the fatigue set in even with them. The parents had flown in from Boise and Coeur d'Alene, pale from shock and days without sleep. They stood together near the ranger station, gripping cups of burnt coffee and asking the same questions we had no answers for. Every so often a shout would rise from the tree line, a false alarm that died as quickly as it started. The camp itself stayed eerily untouched. Food left on the picnic table still drew insects. The boys' notebooks, damp from morning dew, were stacked by the mess tent. One of them had a page half filled with words that looked like they were written by flashlight. "Tomorrow we're hiking the ridge." Tomorrow never came. That first week blurred. We covered 10 square miles on foot, searching every hollow, every animal den, every rockslide edge. I walked enough to wear the soles smooth on my boots. At night, we'd sit around the command tent, radio chatter weaving through the dark like static prayers. I'd go over my notes again and again, looking for what didn't fit the zipped tent, the running fire, the absence of prints. I kept circling back to that 4th figure on the tree. Maybe it was an innocent doodle, or maybe it was something else. When I finally asked Andrea again about it, she wouldn't meet my eyes. Sometimes she said, "I feel like there was someone else that night. A shadow near the edge of the firelight." I told myself it was nothing. I wrote it down anyway. The smallest cracks in memory sometimes turn out to be the fault lines that break the whole thing open. On the 6th day, a thunderstorm rolled in from the west. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and the rain came sideways. The forest swallowed our tracks faster than we could make them. Lightning splintered through the ridge, and the search teams were forced back to base. When it cleared by morning, the landscape looked new. Branches down, earth shifted, every clue drowned under fresh mud. The FBI's lead agent called a halt at dusk that evening. I stood beside him, soaked to the bone, watching the last of the volunteers drag themselves off the trail. "We'll keep a skeleton crew on site," he said, his voice low, tired. "But after tonight, this becomes a long game." He turned toward me. "You think they're out there?" I wanted to answer, but all I could see in my mind was that empty tent and the way the sleeping bags had been laid flat, like someone had smoothed them on purpose. When the search officially ended, I drove back to Boise with the radio off. The silence in the car felt like punishment. The case file went into storage with a tag number I can still recite, 03721GC. Every few months, someone would bring it up, a new theory. A claimed sighting, a supposed footprint found by a hiker, but nothing ever held. The forest had kept its secret. Over the years, other cases came and went, but that one clung to me. Sometimes, driving home late, I'd see the image in my mind, the tree with 4 figures, and wonder which one was turned upside down and why. 20 years later, that memory resurfaced like a body rising after a long submersion. It was September of 2023, a Friday morning, when the air already hinted at fall. I was reviewing cold case digitizations at my desk when a call came through from a field ranger named Ethan Cordell. His voice carried that same tightness I'd heard 2 decades earlier in Andrea's. "You need to come up here," he said. "Granite Creek. We found something." My stomach turned before my mind could catch up. I thought he was joking. Nobody used that name lightly anymore. "What kind of something?" I asked. "A cache," he said. "Old. Looks like it's been there since before the fires. There's a knife inside." He paused. "It's got one of the boys' names on it." By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun was dropping behind the mountains again, casting the valley in that same half-light I remembered. Ethan met me out front, his gloves still dusted with dirt. He didn't talk much, just pointed me toward the evidence table inside. The knife lay there on a folded towel, the handle swollen and cracked, but the letters clear, EH, 2005. Still here. The sight of it did something to the air in that room. It stopped moving. I traced the letters with the edge of a pen cap, careful not to touch. If it was authentic, that carving had been made 2 years after we'd all stopped looking. "Where'd you find it?" I asked. Ethan rubbed his neck eyes on the floor. "In a bear cache. Unregistered. Way off the old fire grid. Place isn't even on the current maps." I glanced up. "You sure it wasn't planted?" He shook his head. "It's been sealed in rust and ash for years. If this was a hoax, it's the most patient one I've ever seen." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the ranger's cabin with the file open beside me, flipping through brittle pages that smelled faintly of smoke. The boys' faces looked younger than I remembered, round, unguarded eyes filled with summer. I read Andrea's first statement again, the one she wrote the morning after. Tent zipped from the inside. Campfire still burning. It felt like reading a message from another life. Out the window, the forest was dark except for the faint light of the moon spilling through the trees. Somewhere out there, something had waited 2 decades to be found. I kept seeing those words burned into the wood. Still here. They weren't just a message from the past. They were a challenge. At dawn, I packed my gear and followed Ethan back up the trail. The ground was slick from overnight frost, and the air smelled of pine pitch and old rain. He led the way in silence, cutting through overgrowth with a machete until we reached the clearing. The cache was barely visible, a metal box half swallowed by roots-charred brush still clinging to its lid. I crouched beside it, tracing the edges where rust met soil. Everything about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong to this forest, or maybe it had been claimed by it so completely it was no longer human. I lifted the lid. Inside were scraps of canvas, burned metal, and ash mixed with damp earth. The knife had been at the bottom, pressed flat as if placed deliberately. Ethan pointed to the ground around it. No prints, no tracks. The brush covered it clean. I stood staring into the trees. The forest was silent again, that same heavy quiet from 20 years before a sound I'd thought I'd forgotten. Only now it didn't feel like absence. It felt like waiting. I radioed Boise that afternoon to request a forensic sweep and a reopening of the case file. The dispatcher hesitated, as if saying the name would summon something back. "Granite Creek," she repeated. After all this time, I told her yes, after all this time. When I hung up, Ethan and I stood at the edge of the clearing, the wind moving slow through the pines. The sunlight caught on the knife handle where the words were carved, and for a brief moment it looked like the letters were glowing. I remember thinking how strange it was that something buried so long could still throw back light. We didn't know then what else the forest was holding, or that the trail beneath our boots led to a place no one had ever searched. All we knew was that the silence had spoken, and we were listening. When dawn came the next morning, the air in the valley had that hollow stillness that only mountain country can hold, like the forest itself was waiting to see if we'd really come back. The knife had reopened the case, but I could feel the years pressing against us, as if the land didn't want to yield what it had buried. I left the ranger cabin with a thermos of burnt coffee, met Ethan at the trailhead, and we started the climb up toward the northeastern slope. He moved quietly, cutting through the undergrowth with steady swings of his machete, every strike echoing in the cold air. The trail narrowed until it wasn't really a trail anymore, just a vein of rock and roots leading into the higher timber. Somewhere above us, a woodpecker hammered against the trunk of a dead pine, slow and methodical like a clock. We reached the slope just before noon. The ground leveled into a small clearing that didn't appear on any of the maps from 2003. I could tell right away something was off. The trees were denser here, younger, as if a section of the hillside had been wiped out years ago and quietly grown back. The soil looked newer than it should, loose and dark, broken by bits of char. Ethan stopped and nodded toward a half-collapsed structure wedged into the incline. It was narrow, almost hidden beneath branches that had fused into it over time. From a distance, it looked like part of the hill, but up close it was unmistakably man-made. "That's what I found yesterday," he said, voice low. Wasn't sure what it was till I cleared the brush. I moved closer. The air near the opening felt colder than it should have been, the kind of chill that settles from within rather than above. The doorway had been reinforced with wood beams cut clean, not scavenged. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. The edges of the structure were damp but solid. It wasn't a storm shelter or a trapper's den. It was deliberate secret. I took a breath and motioned for Ethan to stay behind me as I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned once and then gave. Inside, the light from my flashlight caught a shape that didn't belong, a metal table oxidized with age standing in the middle of a dirt floor. Beyond it I saw cot frames, a lantern, and in the far corner what looked like a pile of drawings curled and discolored from moisture. The air was heavy with mildew and something faintly metallic like rust and dried rain. I picked up one of the drawings and unfolded it carefully. It was done in crayon, the kind of thick, waxy color kids use, though the lines had bled from age. 3 stick figures stood beside a campfire, one boxed in with a square drawn over its face. I didn't need to be told what that meant. It was the same story we'd been circling for 20 years. Another drawing showed 4 figures again, one tied to a tree, a smiling sun above them that somehow made the scene worse. At the bottom, scrawled in pencil, were the words, "He made me watch." I stood there for a moment, feeling the air move through the shelter in small, steady breaths. Then I looked around and noticed something else, a smaller sleeping bag, orange, folded neatly beside a pair of boys' shoes. One of the soles was worn through at the heel. I reached inside the shoe and found a piece of paper folded tight, almost disintegrating. The ink had faded, but 3 words were still legible. I wasn't alone. Ethan had been circling the back wall with his light. "There's a hatch here," he said. When I came over, I saw a square section of floor slatted with wood and sealed around the edges. He used his pry bar to lift it, and a wave of warmer air rose up thick and stale. My flashlight dropped first its beam, catching the gray of concrete instead of dirt. Steps led down into a small chamber. I went first, one hand on the ladder, the other gripping the light. 10 feet down the floor came into view concrete walls, a drain in the center, metal loops bolted to the corners. The place was quiet, but not in the natural way of abandoned things. This silence felt engineered, like the air had been told to behave. In the corner, I found a child's notebook, half soaked through its spiral, rusted from time. I flipped through it gently, most of the pages illegible except one protected by a piece of plastic. The name Elijah was written again and again across the paper, each time a little shakier than the last, until the final line. He kept calling me Mason. I'm not Mason. I didn't move for a long moment. When I climbed back up, Ethan was waiting with his flashlight angled toward the door. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but the truth was I didn't have a word for what I'd just seen. My mind went back to the knife Elijah's initials burned into the handle, the date marked 2 years after the search was over. Maybe he'd survived longer than anyone believed, or maybe someone wanted us to think that. We sealed off the site by dusk, flagged it for forensic teams, and radioed for backup. That night, I stayed in the ranger cabin, the notebook open beside me, tracing the letters with my eyes until they blurred into one another. Somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief, I realized this wasn't about disappearance anymore, it was about captivity. Whoever had taken those boys hadn't done it to kill them quickly. They'd done it to control them. By morning, we had a full team on-site cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar evidence techs from Boise. The dogs were uneasy the moment they stepped out of the truck, whining, pacing, refusing to go near the opening. When they did, their bodies went stiff, not alert to scent, but to something else, something I couldn't name. The slope above the shelter was still damp from overnight rain mud streaking down like veins across the hillside. As the team worked, I walked the perimeter, mapping the terrain. About 100 feet uphill, the soil shifted under my boot, exposing a cut in the ground, a natural drainage line that led straight down to the shelter's roof. I traced it with my eyes and realized what it meant. Back in 2003, a rock slide had closed off this entire section of the forest. The search grid had stopped just short of this ridge. If the shelter had been here, then it would have been buried from sight. We'd been standing less than a mile away, and we never knew. When the radar sweep came back, the technician called me over. "We're getting a return under the main chamber," he said, pointing at the screen. 2 feet down, metal box or crate rectangular. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my neck. We broke through the concrete carefully, the sound of the jackhammer muffled by the weight of the earth. The box came into view, slowly, steel about the size of a milk crate sealed tight. I helped unbolt the corners. The smell hit first, sharp and metallic, a mix of rust, decay, and something faintly sweet, like old blood. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, were several items: a small Polaroid camera, a handful of photographs sealed in a plastic bag, a child's sweatshirt, and something wrapped separately, a cracked molar small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. We moved the box to the field station that evening and began processing the photographs. Most were too blurred to tell much shadow's walls, the glint of metal, but one image froze me. A boy sitting against a concrete wall, bare feet, wrists marked, staring directly into the lens. His face was thin eyes, dark and hollow, but there was no mistaking him. It was Elijah. In another photo, 2 boys lay side by side wrapped in matching blankets, one with a bandage on his chin. Mason, most likely. And the last picture showed the wall of that chamber, names scrawled in red marker, Elijah Mason, and beneath them Caleb crossed out hard enough to tear the surface. Ethan leaned over my shoulder. "Why cross it out?" he asked. I couldn't answer. But as I studied the handwriting, the pattern began to settle in my mind. Names written, erased, replaced. "It's not just marking," I said finally. "It's assignment." Whoever did this was keeping score. I thought of the notebook again, Elijah insisting he wasn't Mason. Maybe he wasn't just correcting someone. Maybe he was fighting for what little identity he had left. We sent the tooth to the lab that night. The call came in just before midnight. The tech's voice was careful, professional, but I could hear the weight behind it. The DNA matched Elijah Hartman, but there was no sign of trauma to the root. It had fallen naturally around age 11. That meant Elijah had been alive at least a year after the boys vanished. Maybe longer. I hung up the phone and sat there staring at the wall, the hum of the fluorescent light filling the room. The thought of him trapped in that place, marking days, carving messages into wood, it hollowed me out. The next morning, one of the dogs caught scent farther up the slope. We followed the lead through slick mud and pine needles until it stopped beneath an old tree root system. The soil had sunk in, forming a shallow depression. When we started digging, the smell of wet earth gave way to something older, fainter, almost gone. A bundle of fabric appeared first, a jacket child-sized. Inside the pocket was a cracked camp ID badge. I brushed off the dirt and read the name, Caleb Thomas. The plastic was split clean down the middle like someone had snapped it on purpose. I looked over at Ethan. "Someone erased him," I said quietly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. We sealed everything into evidence bags and made the slow walk back down to the clearing. The wind had picked up, scattering pine needles across the mud like paper shreds. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting movement, half hoping for nothing at all. There's a moment in every case when you feel the story shifting, when it stops being about what's missing and starts being about what's been taken. This was that moment. That night, as the storm rolled back over the ridge, I sat by the window of the ranger cabin and looked out into the dark. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt inhabited not by the boys, but by the memory of whoever had done this. Someone methodical, patient, capable of living unseen in the same woods we'd searched for years. I opened the case file again and found my own handwriting from 2 decades earlier. Tent zipped from inside. Campfire still burning. I read it twice and realized I'd been wrong to think of that as a mystery. It wasn't the tent that had been sealed. It was the truth. And now it was finally starting to open. Rain started falling again before we even reached the ridge that morning. Fine, cold drops that sank straight through fabric and left a steady hiss across the leaves. The slope above Granite Creek had turned slick overnight, the kind of mud that clings to boots and doubles your weight. Every step forward felt deliberate. The shelter we'd uncovered was tarped and sealed off, now guarded by a pair of deputies who stood in silence beneath the trees, their hoods pulled low. You could tell by the way they avoided looking toward the hill that none of them wanted to be the first to see what came next. The evidence team was still cataloging what we'd found: the drawings, the orange sleeping bag, the cracked camp badge, and that small tooth that had changed everything. Elijah had lived longer than anyone believed. But there was something else in that place. You could feel it the same way you feel heat from a closed oven door. Ethan was already at the site when I arrived. Sleeves rolled up, clipboard damp from the rain. "We're picking up metal under the floor," he said, voice low. 2 feet down. He didn't have to say the rest. I could see the tension in his jaw, that quiet resignation investigators wear when the facts start taking shape faster than the mind can follow. I nodded, pulled on gloves, and followed him into the chamber. The air inside still smelled of mildew and concrete, heavy and still. A tech crouched near the center, scraping away at the floor with a trowel. The sound was soft at first, then sharper as the dirt gave way to steel. A rectangle began to form edges dull with corrosion. The moment the metal showed through, that old silence settled again, the kind that swallows breath and conversation both. We unbolted the corners one by one. The lid gave with a low groan, releasing a draft of air that carried the smell of copper and something older, almost sweet. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were small objects that looked harmless until you realized what they were: a child's sweatshirt, a cracked molar sealed in a bag, a Polaroid camera. Beneath that, a stack of photographs in a Ziploc pouch, the plastic clouded from age. I lifted them out carefully, light catching the faint imprint of water damage. The first few were blurred shots of walls, shadows, corners of what looked like that same chamber. But then a face. A boy sitting cross-legged against the wall, dark hair, matted bare feet planted on concrete. His eyes met the camera directly. I don't know how to describe that stare except to say it didn't belong to a child. It was hollow in a way that suggested too much time had passed since the world had felt real. Elijah, unmistakable even under the weight of years. Another photo showed two boys asleep under identical blankets, one with a bandage across his chin. Mason, maybe. The third image was the one that stayed with me, a wall scrawled with 3 names in red marker. Elijah Mason, and beneath them Caleb crossed out until the ink had cut through to the concrete. Ethan leaned closer, his breath fogging against the lamination. "Looks like someone was keeping track," he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was something methodical about it, almost clinical. Names created, destroyed, rewritten. A pattern of ownership, not memory. I kept thinking about the notebook we'd found, the one that said, "He kept calling me Mason. I'm not Mason." Now it wasn't just a plea. It was evidence. Someone had tried to replace them. That night the lab called about the tooth. It was Elijah's, but it hadn't been pulled. It had fallen naturally, meaning he'd been alive for some time after the disappearance. A year, maybe more. I hung up and just sat there at the ranger's table watching condensation bead along the edge of my coffee cup. The idea of that boy surviving in those woods long enough to lose a baby tooth, long enough to carve words into a knife, was too much to process. I'd worked homicide before, seen the worst of what people can do to one another, but this was different. This was deliberate, organized, patient. Whoever built that shelter hadn't acted out of impulse. They'd planned for years. At first light, we brought the dogs back. They picked up a new scent, almost immediately circling a patch of ground uphill from the structure. The soil was loose, easy to dig. By noon, we'd uncovered a small bundle wrapped in fabric, an old camp jacket, a child's. Inside the pocket, a split ID badge, Caleb Thomas. The break in the plastic was clean deliberate. Someone had taken care to erase the boy even from his own name. I remember holding that badge in my hand, the weight of it barely there, and thinking how strange it was that the smallest things, one broken piece of plastic, could feel heavier than a body. We packed up what we had and hiked down before dark. The sky was low and gray, the kind of weather that never fully commits to rain but keeps you wet anyway. Back at the field office, I called the bureau. They'd already seen the photos. "We're assigning a behavioral team," the agent told me. This wasn't opportunistic. It's structured. He hesitated before adding, "We think this may tie to something older." I knew what he meant. Idaho had a history of unlicensed youth programs, wilderness rehabilitation camps that shut down quietly when oversight caught up. I started digging through state archives, pulling old folders so brittle the edges broke under my fingers. By the end of that week, I found it a file stamped Clearwater Wilderness Behavioral Facility Pilot Camp 7. Operated from 1998 to 1999, terminated after 6 months for improper restraint methods and undocumented disappearances. The name on half the reports was one I didn't recognize at first. Graham Keller, field counselor. Former military, no psychology credentials, terminated for unsupervised contact with minors. My stomach dropped when I flipped the page and saw the note scrawled in pen assigned to Granite Creek Subsector, June-July 2003. The summer the boys vanished. I stared at that page until the ink blurred. We'd all assumed Granite Creek was a camp under state oversight. What if it wasn't? What if Keller had stayed behind after the program was dissolved, running his own version under the radar, testing something he couldn't let go of? It would explain everything: the structure, the conditioning, the obsession with names. He hadn't kidnapped strangers. He'd kept practicing on the kind of kids those programs were meant to reform. I copied the personnel photo stapled to the back of the file and compared it to an old composite sketch from 2006, a man seen wandering near the Granite Creek region. Square jaw, gray at the temples, deep-set eyes. It was him. That night I called Ethan from my motel room outside Boise. He answered on the second ring. "We've got a name," I said. "Keller." He worked for one of those wilderness rehab outfits. There was a pause on the line, just breathing. "You think he's still alive?" he asked. "If he built that shelter the way it looks," I said, "then yeah. People like him don't stop until they're forced to." The next morning I ran Keller's name through DMV databases, property tax records, anything I could access without a warrant. The only active listing was a P.O. box in Darby, Montana, and a long-closed fishing lease registered under his name about 14 miles from the Granite Creek trailhead. We got a search warrant by sundown. The cabin was a half-day drive north, tucked deep off a Forest Service road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The approach was quiet, just the sound of gravel under tires and the ticking of cooling brakes when we stopped. The door wasn't locked. Inside it smelled of damp wood and dust. No furniture, no electricity, but under a loose floorboard in the bedroom, we found what we came for: a stack of Granite Creek staff badges, blank, and a clipboard marked Conditioning Schedule Subject C. Next to it, a photograph. The Camp Group 2003 counselors smiling for the camera. On the far right, barely visible, Keller stood half-turned. No name tag, eyes fixed on the lens. I remember feeling the same chill I'd felt that first morning at the old shelter. He'd been there the whole time in plain sight. Not a stranger, not a phantom. A counselor embedded among them, unaccounted for on any roster. When we brought the evidence back to Boise, I pulled every case file that matched his pattern. Between 1996 and 2003, 5 children had vanished from wilderness programs across the Northwest. All boys, all between 9 and 12. None ever found. The state had written them off as runaways. As night fell, I laid everything out on the table: the photos, the notebook, the knife, the broken badge, and I kept coming back to that one sentence. He kept calling me Mason. It was more than confusion. It was method. Someone had built an entire belief system around erasing identity and replacing it. And now that system had a name. When I finally closed the file, the rain had started again, steady and rhythmic against the window. I thought of the campfire that never went out. The tent zipped from the inside, and how long it takes for truth to make its way back through soil. Keller had been perfecting something, a script, a process, maybe even an ideology, and the boys from Granite Creek were just one chapter in it. Somewhere out there in the deep dark between Idaho and Montana, the rest of that story was waiting, and I knew we were still only halfway through finding it. The warrant for Keller's arrest came through on a gray morning that smelled of rain and pine sap. I remember the paper trembling slightly in my hand, not from fear or excitement, but from something quieter. Relief, maybe, or disbelief that 20 years of questions could finally fit into a single piece of paper. By then, the Bureau had traced him through a chain of false names and abandoned cabins scattered between Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. He'd moved like a ghost, always on foot cache, only using old logging trails no one else remembered. When they finally found him, it wasn't at a cabin or a shack, but inside an old ranger station converted into a storage shed along the Salmon River. He was 62, living under the name Gerald Kane, with a generator, canned food, and boxes of files he'd kept from those wilderness programs' rosters, intake notes, photos of children that should have been returned to their families decades ago. I wasn't there for the arrest. Keller went quietly, almost politely, according to the agents who cuffed him. When I saw him weeks later during the preliminary hearing in Boise, he looked like an old man who'd long since stopped fearing consequence. His hair was white, his frame thinner, but the eyes were the same flat, unreadable, fixed somewhere just past the people speaking to him. During the arraignment, when the charges were read, 5 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of murder, and multiple charges of child endangerment, he didn't look up once. Not when the prosecutor spoke the boys' names, not when the families wept in the gallery. It was as though he'd turned inward to a private language that none of us could enter. Over the months that followed, the case unfolded like a slow exhale. Forensic teams matched soil from the shelter to residue found on Keller's boots. The handwriting on the conditioning logs matched the notebooks recovered from the chamber. DNA from an old blanket tied him to Granite Creek. But the hardest evidence came from the tapes. One of the boxes found in his possession contained a set of VHS cassettes marked only by dates. The Bureau digitized them before I ever saw them. Even through grainy footage, it was impossible to misunderstand what we were looking at: a man with a calm voice speaking to a child off camera, repeating names, forcing them to respond in ways that made my stomach turn. Each session was labeled like a classroom lesson. Correction 1A, Conditioning 2B. The voice was steady, methodical, stripped of emotion. It wasn't rage. It was control. That was his crime in its truest form, not just the taking of life, but the deliberate erasure of identity. The trial never made it to sentencing. In May of 2024, before testimony began, Keller collapsed in his holding cell and never regained consciousness. A cerebral hemorrhage, the coroner said, instant and final. When I got the call, I sat in my office for a long time without moving. No victory, no closure, just silence. The families met with prosecutors that week to hear what would have been presented in court. I was there too, mostly to answer questions about the evidence chain. When Elijah's mother asked me if he'd suffered, I told her the truth as gently as I could, that from what we'd found, he'd fought for who he was until the very end. I don't think it eased her grief, but maybe it gave it shape. The shelter was dismantled the following summer. The forest reclaimed it fast, the same way it had hidden it for 20 years. By fall, only a scar of earth remained, and even that began to fade under moss and pine needles. I went back one last time before it closed to the public. The trail was quiet, damp from rain. Birds moved in the treetops, cautious but unafraid. I stood at the edge of the clearing and tried to picture the camp as it once was. The tents, the laughter, the smell of cocoa from that first night. It was impossible to separate the innocence from the horror anymore, and maybe that's the point. Some places can hold both, and we have to learn to live with that contradiction. For months afterward, I kept thinking about the knife, the one carved with EH 2005. Still here. It sits now in a climate-controlled case at the Idaho State Forensic Archive, tagged and sealed, a piece of evidence that outlived the man who caused it. I sometimes visit it when I'm in the city for training. The handle's darkened more over time, but the words are still clear. Every time I read them, I realize Elijah wasn't leaving a message for help. He was leaving a record. Proof that he existed beyond the fear, beyond the walls Keller built around him. He didn't let himself disappear. Granite Creek itself has changed. The old trail was reopened 2 years ago after the land was cleared and reclassified as protected federal terrain. No overnight camping allowed, no fires, no structures of any kind. Families still drive up sometimes, park by the overlook, and leave small things. Stones, folded notes, a carved stick figure or two. I don't think they're memorials so much as acknowledgments, reminders that the forest doesn't erase everything, no matter how hard time tries. Andrea Shipley, the counselor from 2003, still sends me Christmas cards every year. Her handwriting's gotten shakier, but her words stay steady. Thank you for not giving up. I never know what to write back, so I usually just say, still here. Ethan transferred down to Nevada last year to work with wildfire response. We talk sometimes about the case, though, never for long. Both of us know there's a limit to what can be said out loud before the silence becomes a comfort again. As for me, I stayed in Boise still with the department, though my work's quieter now, mostly reviewing old files, mentoring the newer investigators who still believe every case ends clean. They don't know yet how many stories have edges that never close. Sometimes I'll catch myself drifting during briefings, hearing that faint sound of creek water in the back of my mind, remembering how the air smelled that first morning, the damp canvas, the burnt pine, the stillness that comes before you realize something's missing. It's strange what lingers. Not the sight of the crime or the face of the man who caused it, but the sound of what was once ordinary, the hum of insects, the pop of a fire. The quiet word, good night, echoing through thin canvas walls. I've been asked more than once what this case taught me. I never have a neat answer. Maybe it's that evil doesn't always arrive with noise or warning. Sometimes it builds quietly inside systems meant to help. Or maybe it's that memory once broken can still find ways to speak through drawings, through carvings, through a voice that refuses to be renamed. What I do know is this: justice isn't a finish line. It's the slow, uneven act of remembering. We find what we can, we tell what we know, and we carry the rest forward. The last time I drove past Granite Creek, the sun was setting low across the ridge. The trees cast long shadows over the road, and for a moment the light made the world look almost kind again. I pulled over and sat there for a while, engine ticking. Window cracked to let in the smell of pine. Somewhere far off water moved over stone, steady and indifferent. I thought about those boys, about how their names still find their way into my notebooks, even when I'm writing something else. Caleb, Mason, Elijah. They'll never be just case numbers. They were here, they mattered, and their story changed the way we look at the quiet places that once seemed safe. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for clicks, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because in the end, that's all justice really is, keeping the light steady long enough for someone else to see what was hidden. And if you ever find yourself standing in a place that feels too quiet, listen closely. Sometimes the silence isn't empty, it's full of voices waiting to be remembered.